Welcome to another episode of Stewart Squared, the podcast that me and my father are doing, where we talk about real time, we talk about persistent networks, we talk about the history of personal computing, we talk about how the history of personal computing relates to the internet and the mobile, and then what we're doing today. And last week we started a conversation about fiduciary responsibility as a investor, as a founder, and all these other things. So we're going to pick up where we left off on that one. So what's your take, Dad?
On fiduciary responsibility. Wow. Well, I could address any one of those topics. And as you know, we have a tendency to wander around.
Yeah.
But if we start with fiduciary responsibility, it's a complicated and not very well defined topic, but it basically says that if you're responsible for financial dealings, that you have a responsibility to do the right thing. And a legal expert would be much more precise about this, but so I represent a firm in which people invest, and then we buy shares of companies to fulfill our fiduciary responsibility to our investors. But then we also own shares in a company, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to the company to do the right thing for the company, and presents frequently a conflict of interest, and venture capitalists are nothing if not managers of conflict of interest. And so you can sit there and say, as I did recently for one of my companies, we got an offer to invest a lot of money in the company, but at half the valuation. And we'd been out raising money from other investors at the 100% of the valuation. And so when we decided to accept that financing, we had to inform all the people who had just invested at twice the valuation that we were accepting a down round. And wow, well, we have a responsibility to our investors because that just cut our value of our investment in half. And we also had a responsibility to the company to do the thing that long-term would be successful for the company. But we also had a fiduciary responsibility, all the investors that had just invested as shareholders of the company. And that was a really complicated thing. And a lot of people got really pissed off, and it created a lot of tension over a very short period of time.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because it fits with something that I've thought for a long time, and I've tried to navigate because I grew up in San Francisco, and San Francisco is the headquarters of psychology speak, and boundaries. Talk about boundaries, right? And psychology is really good boundaries in personal settings and such. And then,
In theory.
yeah, in theory, yeah, exactly, in theory. And it's a moving target. But then I've also grown up with you talking about these various things for a long time. And I remember one time you had a T-shirt that I stole that said "No conflict, no interest." And
I think I had that made because I love that phrase. No conflict, no interest.
And it pissed me off.
The managing partner of NEA, my first venture capital firm, said that constantly, and I picked it up. He had all these great one-liners, but the best one of all was "No conflict, no interest." And basically the underlying thought in that phrase is, you know a lot about a particular thing, so you're invested in it, at least psychologically and emotionally you're invested in it. So that gives you an interest, and if you act on that interest, particularly in a financial way, it creates a conflict of interest. And so it's because then you're suspect if you're a shareholder in something that is affected by that interest. I mean, I'm not doing a great job of articulating this, but it sort of is instantly apparent what no conflict, no interest means, and which is that you can only have conflict about stuff you already know about.
But it's really
the reason I said that,
yeah,
if you want to hear this, is that at the same time I was at NEA and making investments in company and acquiring an interest. I was also writing for Fortune magazine, and the editors wouldn't allow me to write about the companies that I invested in. But of course, I spent my entire life learning about those companies and knowing about them and knowing about the domain they operated in. So I go, how do I not write about the companies and the things that I know about? Um, and, the normal rule is you disclose any conflicts. And so I would always try to disclose it. They would just tell me I can't write about companies and I'm an investor in. So it's like, the time sitting there for 8 years, I was sitting there trying to navigate this conflict. So I could only write about stuff I was not invested in, which meant anything I had failed to find an investment in, which is the stuff I would know the least about.
Okay, there's a lot of different questions that I have from this. There's the new business that I'm starting now. I want to ask you about what are all the embedded the embedded conflict of interest within that. But then there's also just the juicy like no conflict, no interest is contrary to a lot of behavior that I saw in Silicon Valley, which is the investor basically plays nice, pretends that everything's all right, and then does some really shady stuff in the background. And like the fakeness of Silicon Valley, which we were talking about last week as well. And it's always interesting to see, I don't know, like to see the way you behave and the impression I had of it when I was younger. And now as I'm older, seeing it and having a different opinion on it than the impression that I was given. I mean, there's some family stuff here that maybe we don't need to go into as well, but like it's just it's very impressive to now that I'm older and more wise to see the way you manage tension and also maybe some things you've learned along the way about how you manage tension. Like we've talked a lot about Steve Jobs and the way he evolved over time. And I'm sure you had a similar evolution as you went, right?
Well, you're wandering around, but let me get you started.
Yeah.
So at the first 20 years, about halfway through which you were born, as a trade journalist. And, I come from journalism background because my father, my uncle were both journalists. And so I was steeped in the theory of journalism.
Mm.
And, in a business like the personal computer industry was when I got started with it, which is kind of when it got started, it was very fast moving. Like every week something would happen and you'd have to decide whether this is important or not and whether you should pay attention to it, independent of writing stories or anything else. And so I had the advantage of understanding what the issues were, and the nut, the the absolute core of it is you yourself have to maintain an attitude that is trustworthy, right? So, and we were talking earlier about trust. Trust is, I think, the whole issue of life, right? If you can't be trusted or if you can't trust yourself, it's very hard to have a happy and productive life. And I adopted that attitude really early on. And I always loved the story about George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and then going to his father and saying, "Dad, I'm sorry, I cut down the cherry tree," and he got whooped as a result. But, you learn early on that you have to maintain some level of integrity. And if you do maintain a level of integrity, you can choose how much that is. And I've always had this just core principle that I'm honest, that I treat people well, and that's always served me well, particularly because in my first 20 years, particularly when I started writing my newsletter about the computer industry, um, people trusted what I said. They knew that I was trying to do the best, even if I was pissing them off. And so I established very tight relationships with a lot of people that were running companies in the personal computer industry because they knew I was doing that. They understood what I was doing. And so anyway, my belief is that, if you go to fiduciary responsibility or if you go to conflicts of interest, that it's up to you to maintain your integrity and manage that process. And so the other piece of this that I was going to say is when I worked for magazines originally, the whole business has kind of gone to hell in a handbasket, but
Yeah.
back in the day, magazines were a core media form. And they had this inherent conflict of interest,
Uh,
which is discussed constantly among magazine editors, which is that most of the money comes from advertising. And but so if editors cross the line and start writing about those advertisers,
uh,
yeah, they lose the trust of the reader. So you have to maintain what's always called a Chinese wall, or a separation between church and state. These are the phrases that were used in the magazine business. So I actually ended up believing at a high level that magazines were in the business of managing conflict, right? That the organization had to manage conflict. And that came down to, like, the editors shouldn't talk to the advertising salespeople or vice versa. And this is very true in great journalistic enterprises like the New York Times and Time Inc. and places like that. And so if you understand that and you put it on the table and you say that's your job, is to manage this conflict of interest between one set of customers and another set of customers, between advertisers and readers, that it trains you to understand how to manage conflict of interest, particularly for me, when I became an investor, a venture capitalist who I'm paid to make money, and I was still writing for Fortune magazine.
Okay, this is great because this is relates to we talk trust in institutions, which is deteriorated, and then that
Yeah.
relates to what I'm calling this thing that I'm doing now, which is well, actually what my first client actually wrote, which is enterprise journalism, which is the thing that is feeling like it's going on. And then that relates to the last 10, 15 years and being told, about your career and then my grandfather's career in journalism, and then seeing how journalism is one of the institutions that has lost the most trust for very, very good reasons. But it also,
I
yeah,
can
go
talk
for it.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and this new business model and the responsibility for me as well as to, in this new business model, what I can do, what I can't do, and that integrity and everything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where do you want to start?
Well, you just said that journalism has lost a lot of trust, which actually don't think it's any different. They didn't have a whole lot of trust 50 years ago.
Yeah. Interesting.
People
Some
are
journalists.
suspected the
Yeah. Yeah.
media manipulating
Yeah.
things, but and so trust is the thing that has to survive regardless of what the distribution method is, or the form of the business. And so I read this book about the New York Times, just called The Times, by Adam Nagurney, I think his name was. And it's about the period of time when the New York Times went from being the old gray lady printing a newspaper to being a modern digital media company. And it struggled mightily with this because it had institutions and ways of acting as an institution that were completely challenged by digital media. And they navigated it successfully, to the degree that you look around and you go, well, the Washington Post hasn't done such a good job. The Wall Street Journal is pretty good. And
Oh.
all the newspapers have collapsed. And, with some exceptions like the LA Times and San Francisco Chronicle, but or otherwise known as the Comical. But the thing that has to survive is trust, right? That's the core service that a journalistic enterprise is doing. And if you have trust, you can kind of figure out the rest of it, right? Because then people will be willing to pay you, or, put up with the advertising or whatever it is. If you have that trust, you have an audience, and audience is the core thing that a journalist needs to have. So now there are institutions that are completely digital, that have started out and have a Substack newsletter or do their own,
Yeah.
and that are successful enterprises. So there are new journalistic enterprises that are completely digital, that have trust, that have built that trust. And so I believe I'm right in this, that it is trust that makes the value worth
Yeah.
customers paying for it, one way or the other.
Yeah. And then the audience part is the thing that's the most interesting thing to me, because that's so far been the most elusive for me in terms of my I have an audience. It's a small audience and they're highly engaged. And there seems to be no common thread among that audience, except for rabid curiosity. I guess a lot of engineers and founders.
You are the glue.
Yeah, yeah, I'm my own audience, basically.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you're serving yourself, but there's other people like you that want
Yeah.
to know the same thing.
Yeah.
You can scale this. You can think about this in terms of scale. Yeah, we've talked about this previously, but I had this printed newsletter that I started because I couldn't hold a job. So I was sitting there trying to figure out what to do. And this is actually, I started it 7 months before you were born. And uh, and so you were on the way. And I was
Yeah.
sitting there going, what the heck do I do? I just lost my last job and
Oh God. Yeah, I got another kid.
I got another kid coming and I have a mortgage and I'm on, so I started this newsletter so I built the newsletter, right? I ended up having, I think, 2,000 subscribers, and then I'd have 400 people who come to my conference every year. And I built a nice little business. It was doing a couple of $1 million a year and making money. And so that was very comfortable. Of course, I wasn't happy with being comfortable. I had to keep messing around with it. But that was a very small scale, right? So I actually just listened. I sent this around to the partners at my firm because I needed to say this to somebody. I'll say it to you. There's a guy named Marques Brownlee who does product reviews on YouTube. I listen to this guy and I go, like, this guy thinks exactly the same way I thought about it, right? Back when the personal computer industry was starting. But he's got 19 million followers on YouTube.
Whoa.
And he started to employ people because he can't manage the whole thing himself. He's the talent. And so I'm like going, wow, that's really a revelation that if I was 40 years younger,
Yeah.
he started when he was 19 and I think he's like 32 now. If I was 40 years younger, this is how I do it, as opposed to the way I did it 40 years ago. And so,
Well,
but he has trust because you watch his videos and he's talking to you about this product and whether it works or not. He did a famous review of the Humane AI pen, which went viral because it called the worst product I've ever reviewed. I think he's sympathetic to the people that make the products, but he's like sitting there serving the people who might buy it. And I just listened to a podcast where Ben Thompson from Stewart III, I can't remember pronounce that thing, but they who interviewed him about why he does the podcast and how he's gotten to have so many followers.
Yeah,
really interesting.
So this is really so because you were writing for an audience that was very particular because it was a bunch of CEOs all in this small community, and we've discussed before how technology no longer is this small community, now it's everywhere.
Yeah,
but then everywhere. Your father, my grandfather, he was writing at a time where and it was to an audience of the entire United States middle class, basically,
and the world.
So all over the world they would read him.
Yeah. It was syndicated like in the International Herald Tribune and other English language newspapers. Probably like the Daily in Israel and anyway, round and about. Yeah,
and
I mean, he was well known internationally.
How many people would read him?
That's really hard to say because the measurement of readership at the time was much different. He was syndicated in newspapers that sort of collectively had millions of subscribers. He was syndicated in, I'll probably get the number wrong, but like 120 newspapers around the country. And then there were a few overseas. And that was in the beginning. That was the 1946 to 1958. There was no real way to audit exactly how many people were reading them or, how it got passed around or what the, what the true readership is, but it had to be in the millions. And of course, it was read intensively in Washington, D.C. and in London and places of power, because that's really what he accomplished. Then he went into the magazine business. He could say the Saturday Evening Post had a circulation in its peak of like 10 million subscribers. And how many of those read that back page column? And then he did Newsweek and so on and so forth. So it's like the way you would measure the impact of my father, your grandfather, is more by what the reaction was to what he wrote. And he did make things happen.
So this is really interesting because this gets into the evolution of media, and as we've discussed before, you can pinpoint various things, but it all goes back all the way to the back of history, like
But not the whole history. Until Gutenberg invented the printing press, there was no press.
well,
right? There was no way of distributing printed material to a mass audience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But there was an audience. There was an audience because it goes back to the written word, and I mean, in some ways, just to the spoken word as well, because the spoken word, they would, I was reading about Rome, and Rome, they would have the town criers, and they would go up in front and they would do advertisements. They would actually do advertisements back, so they would get paid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So but like the scale thing is the different parts, and that's actually a really good entry into where we're at now, because scale feels like it reached its peak with television. The debates this week, right? Well, but in terms of having a large captive audience all on the same
a single audience, and that's time-based. That's the fact that television was delivered it on a structured basis, right? So at 7 p.m. you could watch the show, and you'd see the phenomena of like 50 million other people watching the same show.
The moon
that's
landing
been fragmented by the internet now, and now we all do streaming and digital, whatever it is. You can't collect that many people at once at one point in time. Actually, the only thing would be like the debate, which we couldn't watch. I started watching it, and 10 minutes in, as Biden was stumbling around, it was like, oh God, painful.
It was very painful and sad. Yeah.
Yeah. But the reports were the next day that 50 million people watched it. Less than the prior debate, but still 50 million people.
And that was
a real time event. So
that's almost to the moon, right? That's almost for the moon landing.
I don't know. I can't. You could go back and figure that out and ask ChatGPT.
Yeah.
What was the peak television? Usually the Super Bowl is the peak.
650 million viewers watched the first steps on the moon, and then Seinfeld. Seinfeld is the other one. Season.
The Super Bowl. What's peak viewership of Super Bowl? That's one of the few events that people all watch at the same time. Because you don't want to find out what the score is without watching the game.
So that is 123 million viewers. So 1/4 of the moon landing, and then 50 million last night for the and so that's all people in sharing the same sort of space and time. But those are
time is the critical
thing.
Yeah. Meta has 2 billion. I think it's 2 billion active daily users or active weekly users, something like that. So the internet scales, but it's not all in the same time. It's asynchronous.
And this actually is leading to something I think a lot about now, which is asynchronous remote work. There's remote work, which is, and at my last company, they tried to do synchronous remote work, and it was a nightmare for me personally, because everybody had to be on the same page at the same time for the same meeting, even if you're in Thailand. So meaning that you're up at 4 a.m. doing a call so that you can match it and so it was just a total nightmare for me. And I moved physical locations so it would fit my chronotype, and I could have meetings when I wanted to. And then my boss moved to Thailand, and totally screwed it up. And so asynchronous is now definitely the way I would go. But there's something that happens at 150. This goes back to the scale conversation, 150 employees, where remote synchronous work no longer works, basically. And then it's a huge challenge to the company. But there's this side problem of asynchronous remote work, which is what I want to do, but I don't want to ever grow above 150 people, so that I never face this. What's your take on remote work and asynchronous remote work and synchronous remote work?
There's only a few companies that have managed to be completely virtual.
Yeah.
Completely remote, right? No headquarters. And Invisible is not the first, but it probably one of like a half a dozen. So that's that much.
Yeah.
Because the pressure to be in the same place at the same time and communicate with each other in real time is intense. And because otherwise it's slow and it's hard to respond to what's going on in real time. And so just on the face of it, there aren't very many companies that pull this off, and particularly at scale. And I'm trying to remember that Oracle bought the company that was completely virtual. The first one that really achieved that was a
Oh,
database. Now I can't remember. Like I can almost remember it was like the CEO was a Swedish guy, I think. So he had kind of a Swedish type name. Not in my weakening memory. I'd have to go dig to find it. But but that was talked about a lot as the first virtual company. And then if you go past that, Oracle bought it. And then after that, how many virtual companies are there? It's almost nil.
but there's a certain point where a company itself has to become remote work, and this is not something that's new. This is something that, you know, the emperor of Rome did asynchronous remote work because he was writing letters. Like that type of
Yeah.
work has always existed, and a multinational company also experienced. This would actually be a beautiful thing to ask you about, because it's not within even you know, because you know that I don't fit into normal society, basically. So like
Yeah.
even just a job is a big thing, but a job at a multinational company like IBM, like, can you explain more of what that felt like?
I'll give you an anecdote that's illustrative. And I have a lot of reference points to Apple. So I always wonder, maybe I should find other reference points, but
Uh-huh.
I got the privilege of going to visit the Apple spaceship campus. Um, and while I was doing that, the fellow I was visiting with told me that the building can only handle 14,000 people. The whole building can handle
Yeah.
14,000
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at any one time, there's only 10,000 people there. And yet Apple employs 300,000 people, something like that, worldwide. So 290,000 people who work for Apple have never been to the headquarters. So you're absolutely right. And yet Apple has an incredibly strong culture and organization, one that very rarely makes mistakes, and which is a total phenomenon. I mean, IBM has been through multiple generations of growth, and you know it's not viewed as a powerhouse company now, but that's partially because they've had a really hard time coordinating that big an employee base.
Yeah.
So it is a challenge, and there aren't very many companies that master it. And I believe that Apple has mastered it.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's like incredible internal tension and pressure, and it's a high pressure environment, and people that want to move up in Apple have to, you know, walk the talk
Yeah.
the walk, whatever it's called. Um, and so they can use that culture to influence how everybody behaves inside the company, even though, you know, there's a fair number of people that work in China for Apple.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
they have retail stores there. I'm sure and they have manufacturing operations. So um it's a you know, when you get to that level of scale, you're worth a couple $1 trillion and you have hundreds of thousands of employees. That's a pretty rarefied atmosphere.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about that, because the rarefied mystical. It's a very mystical thing of how to get a company to that size. It's extremely hard, like impossible, basically. It defies any sort of rational thing, and this gets into the whole Steve Jobs vibe as well. Like something that happened at Apple in the 1980s and the 1990s allowed them to be the company that we just discussed. And it seems really hard, almost impossible. But then my understanding is that a lot of companies view venture capital and view the venture game as one at which, if they can raise the required amount of money and they have a somewhat plausible business, that they can get to the escape velocity of being so big that they can no longer die. Is that accurate?
Too big to fail. Yeah. Well, what's the last big company that failed? Uh, IBM's a great example. Microsoft is a really interesting example because they were really going sideways when Steve
Yeah.
Ballmer was CEO, and he
Oh,
was CEO for 10 years. And then Satya Nadella took over, and the company has just
yeah.
taken off.
It's back.
That's a really hard thing to do, take over a struggling organization that's already big and then make it a growth company. There's only four $3 trillion companies, and there's more. NVIDIA just joined the tribe, but it's
Uh-huh.
Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, think it might be Google,
Yep.
have a market value of 3 trillion. And then Amazon just crossed 2. So the more than $1 trillion valuation companies is a very small club. And but you try to identify companies that have disappeared or failed. You may not think about them a lot, but like Dell is a 70-80 billion dollar company.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's kind of small potatoes now.
Yeah.
So you got a lot of companies out there that are worth less than $1 trillion that are very successful and make a lot of money and have a big impact on their employees, their customers, their shareholders. So it's, if you talk about the top of the pyramid, it's like, that's a very rarefied atmosphere. And the fact that Tim Cook went from, he has increased the value of Apple from like 300 billion to 3 trillion. It's remarkable. Buy a share of Apple back when Steve died. I thought about it, but I go like, but that's Steve. And Steve is the guy who designed Apple, designed the system at
Tim
Apple.
Cook just ran with it.
Well, ran with it and optimized
it. Interesting.
So,
We could go into partnership and how like business duos dynamic kind of create these amazing things as well. But there's something you said about not dying as a company, because I feel like I have no interest in building a company at that level, like playing at that level, because it feels like my mental health would get just run through basically. Like there's no point to it. But then, is it true that you need to get to a scale? Because there's lifestyle businesses, then there's businesses, and like it's a big gap between that lifestyle business and something like Dell. And then there's Apple, but there's all sorts of businesses in between that are doing 1 million, 10 million, 15 million, 50 million, 100 million. Like where does the company, because I guess they only fail if they outsize their ambition, right? If they decide to take a large amount of money from a venture capitalist and then fail to reach that escape velocity.
I just met a guy who's counter to everything. And I have to be careful I don't identify him, but his father started a company, and the company went bankrupt. And it was venture backed. And so he's like, his father's like sitting there trying to figure out what to do. And he described how a grant came through for the former company. The government moved so slowly that the grant got approved after the company went bankrupt. And so he persuaded the government to give him the grant and started a new company with it. So with $50,000, and him and his son joined him, and the son's the one I talked to. His son joined him, and his son is going like, I don't really want to work with my father, but I'll do this for a while. And then he went to Harvard Business School. He ended up spending 40 years with the company with his father.
Wow.
And his father's in his 90s now. And they just a year ago sold the company for $1 billion. Never raised capital. Never took on debt. They built the company piece by piece without any outside capital, and yet they managed to sell it for $1 billion. It had 100 million of revenue, 120, and so it was sold for 10x revenue. And the acquiring company felt that they could make something out of that. It fit with their business, and that's just a remarkable story. And I love stories like that because the first company went bankrupt after being funded by venture capitalists. So that company never raised capital and ended up being, but it took 40 years.
Yeah. And it's I guess the theme of this conversation is time, and like what time does to it, and what the time does to companies. But it reminds me of the last 10 to 15 years, harkening back to the last conversation we had about Silicon Valley as this sort of place that's maybe peaked in now people are buying into their own bullshit, but the last 10 years have been so hyped in terms of venture capital and raising venture capital and turning it into a business that but it's only because they're watching what other people do and like the fundraising announcement party, the fundraising party. Everybody wants to go to the fundraising party because there's the social proof and all of that stuff. And it's so different from the Silicon Valley that it feels like I grew up with, but maybe, maybe you have some insight.
It's not the first, not the first time it happened.
Yeah.
The scale is bigger and bigger over time. So
Yeah.
it's like this sine wave that gets higher and higher over time.
Yeah.
The internet bubble between 1994 and 2000, same thing happened, but it was smaller scale, right? But funds were raised, and it was like everybody's sitting around going, these gigantic funds, like $1 billion, right? And now we're talking about funds that are, 10 billion or 12 billion.
Yeah.
The scale has changed. So if you believe that this wave is happening, and there were prior waves, smaller and more disk drive wave, and so if you go back, there was an AI wave in the 80s. Big small companies being funded at big valuations for the time, mostly in Massachusetts, ironically. And there was the microcomputer or mini computer wave. I mean, so there are multiple waves through the history of technology, because technology shows up and people like lock onto it and go, "Oh, this is like a really big deal." And then it feeds this enthusiasm cycle, and then it goes too far and it crashes. And we're in a period right now where it's readjusting, but it's going to happen again. I mean, AI is happening as a focus thing inside of this not very good environment for fundraising.
Yeah.
And but there will be a general thing that happens. Maybe when we get to AGI and computers become much smarter, including the ones we have. I love that Apple announced Apple Intelligence, which happens to be AI.
So let's take this last 10 minutes to go into that, which is, it feels like AI is the last hurrah of software as this identifiable thing that can maybe be invested in. I'm not, this is a hard thought to make clear, but like, it feels like it's the coup de grace of the personal computing industry, and of it feels like that. And then the next thing is going to start getting much crazier in terms of deep tech, hard tech, and by deep tech and hard tech, I'm talking about material science, things like space factories. I recently interviewed Delian, the president of Varda Space Industries, and they're doing space factories. So they're shooting up a rocket with a factory in it, and then designing microcrystals and for pharmaceutical applications, and solar panels in space, and Starlink, and all these different things that are coming around, and then quantum computing, and so like that feels like where the next big thing, maybe it's a couple of years away, maybe it's 10 years away, but where the next kind of like world shattering things that happen in 1996, 97, those types of things. Do you agree? What do you think about that?
So the only way to handle this is to form your own opinion about the whole thing, right? So what will life look like 10 years from now? I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I listened to Ezra Klein's podcast. He's so curious and smart that he asks all the right questions. And he gave this anecdote on one podcast about how, I go back and look at the Jetsons, the TV show, the animated TV show in the 60s, and think about what they proposed as a vision of future life, right? Your food would pop out of the wall, and your maid would be a robot, and you'd fly around in these little flying cars. And he calculated it based on what they said in the series, that in 2024, George Jetson would be 2 years old. And so George Jetson was the dad, right? So he's in his 40s or 50s in the Jetsons. So what's going to happen in the next 40 to 50 years? And are we going to get to the Jetsons? And nobody thinks so. No, we're so far away from that we're still here in our grungy little physical world. And so you have to know enough and have a strong enough opinion to describe what that future will look like in what period of time.
Mm.
And
Mm.
this is why I've been thinking a lot about real time and satellite networks and stuff like that, because in order to break through and stop messing around with, all these little devices that we have, um, and have kind of the perfect future, you have to imagine the thread that happens between here and there. So yeah, quantum computing is a pretty mysterious thing. I can't
Yeah.
quite tell you what it means, but
Yeah.
and AGI is something that's quite different than generative AI. And
Mm.
and and there's a sort of fundamental issue of, well, do you believe that we can manage this process so that it serves us, or does it become something that takes over and
Yeah.
creates a dystopian future? Um, like the what were the movies that
Terminator.
Terminator?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have
There's
to go
many.
back.
There's many. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ones, particularly now. Um, So I am an optimist, and so I've constructed a view of what will happen. And it's be long after I'm gone, but that there will be a better future. But we're still going to have like living houses, and we're still going to drive cars. They might be electric, and they might be smart, and you know, it'll still be kind of like what we look like now, but it will be different, and uh,
Mm.
and it will become, because of the computers will get smart enough to be helpful.
Mm. Which seems like it's been a theme of because you've been seeing this, you've wanted computers to do things that me growing up with computers as this sort of water that I'm swimming in, rather than this thing that was invented during your lifetime, that I didn't even ask, because because it's the water. Like it's not something that was like really invented
Yeah.
when I was, yeah.
My father's stuff is not on the internet.
Mm.
It wasn't part of his life.
Yeah.
That was pre-internet.
And
The
and
internet.
speaking of which, we should get him on the show by training a LLM on him at some point. That would be fun to do.
That a little spooky for me, maybe.
uh, uh, how did you get into deep tech? How did you get into satellites? How did what were the chain of events that led you into investing in satellites?
Um, I knew nothing.
Mhm.
I really knew nothing
Yeah.
about space, satellites, rockets. Obviously, I'd read about Elon Musk and SpaceX, and what little anybody else would know anyway. Um, but I got pitched on a really interesting deal, which we didn't end up investing in. But one of the people in that came back and proposed to me to invest in a satellite propulsion company, which I'm still an investor in. He's not there anymore.
Mm.
Third CEO.
Mm.
Um, and that started the chain. But the deal that I originally was looking at was this guy in his, he lived in a barn, and in his backyard, so to speak, he figured out this scheme to use weather balloons to float a glider up to the stratosphere, um, with a camera attached to the bottom of it, a high resolution digital camera, just off the shelf. And so he proposed that if you could fly enough of these weather balloons, and then it would release the glider, and the glider would return to Earth with the camera. Cool. So it didn't involve any uh, wireless communications. Um, that you could get much better pictures of Earth, because it would be closer to Earth with much higher resolution. And he had this in one of his slides. He had this thing where here's what the current satellite can do. And it was a lady sitting next to her pool in a bathing suit, and this is what we could do.
Yeah.
And you could see the lady, you could see the bathing suit, whereas the other one is kind of like this
Blurry.
big. And I was fascinated by that, and I tried to pursue it. And the guy who founded the company, and got a whole story about him, but decided to sell it.
Mm.
He actually sold it to Apple, of all places, but and not for very much money, but he made some money. And but we never invested. So then one of his co-founders came and proposed company that I'm invested in. And so it was a transition from this cool thing about kind of flying weather balloons and drone gliders and stuff like that, which I just thought was really cool, which my partners were not very positive about, to doing this satellite propulsion deal. May now become successful like 10 years later.
And this is funny because then the drones came in out of nowhere, and now drones are very
Drones,
important.
they didn't come out of nowhere. We looked at a number of deals for investing in drones as well. 3D printers. I mean, this is, if you're in the hard tech business and during our period of time, this is the stuff you'd be looking at. It's very hard to navigate.
Because of the timelines, right?
The timelines, and you really, because we invest so early, you can't really tell what's going to happen. It's a little bit of a random walk. It's why we don't invest in video games, because, you know, how do you compare one video game to another and decide that this one's going to work and that one's not? It's like it's a little random walk.
Yeah.
You know, we believe that because we understood the technology, mainly because of Gilman, that we could predict which ones would work.
Very interesting. Okay, well, that seems to do it. Thank you so much for talking, and I'll see you next week.
Always a pleasure.